This is a Renegade Media Network podcast.
Let's talk about the official coffee of the Counterflow podcast, and that is Russaigate Coffee. These guys are loyal supporters of this show, and I'm thankful because their coffee is in my coffee mug every morning. You know, once I changed the name of this show, that of course I'm bringing them over with me. They are hardcore libertarians, great supporters, and their coffee is so damn good. It's imported directly from Italy. They've got a great shop over at Lorenzotti.coffee, LORENZOTTI.coffee. And on there, you can find all kinds of stuff, including this great looking coffee bean grinder that I need one of those. They've got nice looking tins that you can get the coffee and store it in if you'd like. They've got giant bags, medium bags, bundled packages so you can order several at a time, all vacuum sealed, of course. And since they support me here, you guys get a discount when you use promo code BUCK, B-U-C-K. That is promo code BUCK, and you will get 10% off of your order. If you want delicious coffee and you like this show, go to Lorenzotti.coffee and use promo code BUCK to get 10% off of your order. You'll be supporting the Counterflow podcast and the great liberty-minded company of Russaigate Coffee.
You are now listening to the Counterflow podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, cause I call him the hologram brass, but I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquids, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lorditis, but I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, guys? What's up? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow podcast. So, obviously, in this day and age, a lot of us don't trust the corporate press, the legacy media, call it what you will, but I don't believe that many of you guys listening look to the New York Times or CNN or MSNBC or just your nightly news even at this point for accurate reporting and voices that you can trust. So, I wanted to bring you my guest today because I've been asked many times, what news sources do you trust? Which writers and journalists do you trust? And I reached out to one that I really enjoy and I definitely trust. His name is Michael Tracey. And, you know, I can't even pinpoint where he is politically. I can guess that he's left of me, but some of you guys might be too. And here's one of the things I noticed throughout the years, the last 5 years at least, the journalists and writers that were left of center and reported Russaigate for what it truly is, being not just a hoax, a soft coup, basically by the deep state. I don't even like using the term deep state, but you guys know what I'm talking about. If you could find a left of center journalist that was reporting accurately on that, you knew, in my opinion, that you have someone with integrity and that you can trust. And there were some, not very many were there, Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, and my guest today, Michael Tracey, was one of those people. And he writes actually for several outlets, unheard.com, vice.com. I find a lot of his stuff on muckrack.com. You can search Michael Tracey and muckrack, and it's got a lot of his articles. I will give you a taste here of basically, here's some of his latest writings. Al Sharpton is a huge fraud. We are really starting to panic about heroin in America. The capturing of the Capitol. Media cheers DC under military occupation. Impeachment is more dangerous than Trump. The quote-unquote crisis is corporate liberal authoritarianism. See, now I think, judging by the listeners that I am friends with and know, you would like some of these articles. I'm telling you, the guy's writing is writing you can trust. And it's 2021. That is not all that common these days. So that's why I wanted to reach out. I've been following him on Twitter for quite some time, and I've appreciated what he has done with me here on Counterflow today. Michael Tracey, welcome to the show. I've followed your content for some time, so I'm pleased to have you here.
Well, I don't know if that's a good or bad thing necessarily, but I appreciate anybody who has the stomach to follow along with what I put out into the universe for a while.
I have a feeling that you probably get pigeonholed and labeled incorrectly quite a bit, and with a lack of nuance, we'll say. I'd like, in your words, to hear what does Michael Tracey do for a living, and let's even get into, if we can, after that, how I'm not even sure how I would describe you politically, and I'm afraid I would do it incorrectly. So I'd like to get into those kind of things with you.
Well, a favorite pastime of people on the internet is to attempt to ideologically pigeonhole me and I guess others, but that's something I encounter pretty frequently. You know, in terms of the ideological aspect, I don't spend a lot of time attempting to characterize myself with some kind of pithy label. I often find that's very tedious. And not that there's anything inherently wrong with ascribing to a specific ideologically relevant or meaningful label, but I often find it becomes this parlor game, or it becomes something that is just done out of habit, or in other words, it doesn't really convey anything particularly significant in my experience. So I don't really devote a whole lot of energy toward that end. I'm almost more happy to let others interpret me however they see fit. But at the same time, I'm almost always happy to tell you what my view is on a particular issue. Usually, hopefully, that view is informed by some kind of independent analysis, sometimes in-person reporting. And so, you know, it's not a matter of trying to be cagey. It's a matter of questioning the logic of the entire pigeonholing enterprise. In terms of what I do, you know, I call myself a journalist. Now, the whole notion of journalism and what it means to be a member of the media, which I guess you are as well, in a sense, has really been stretched thin over the years. So it doesn't really impart a whole lot of information if you just say I'm in the media, because, you know, anybody can theoretically launch a podcast or a YouTube channel or what have you. But I like to say journalist because hopefully it connotes some degree of fidelity to factual reality. Not that most journalists, or not that all journalists necessarily have that same fidelity or have the same interpretation of what that fidelity requires. But I like to use that term, or I've used that term now for, I don't know, 10 plus years, just because hopefully it indicates a little bit more depth than just any schmuck spouting off about the day's news, which, you know, I do just as anybody else does, but it tends to be a little more grounded in something that's slightly more analytical. And that's not to puff up journalism as some kind of moral exemplar, or journalists as moral exemplars. But, you know, I initially perceived myself as somebody who was doing written journalism, right? So obviously then as the years went on and YouTube became more ubiquitous, and and audio-visual became a much more central component of what it means to be a journalist, I adapted to that. But I've always kind of perceived myself to be grounded in the written word, not to sound pretentious. So I guess that's why I go with the term journalist, even though there are obviously plenty of journalists who do almost entirely audiovisual work now. But at the point is, I don't really. A lot of professional journalists are very wedded to that term and almost defensive of it, where they have this whole kind of epistemology of what it means to be a journalist, what you need in order to gain admittance into exclusive journalism clubs. I've always had a visceral aversion to that kind of mentality. And so usually if I'm introduced someplace, it'll be independent journalist, right? Or it'll be freelance journalist. I don't like the term freelance that much, because it has some odd connotations, but independent is fine. You know, I'm sustained largely by people who enjoy or appreciate what it is that I do and have opted to fund me. And then I also write for major publications, magazines, journals, newspapers, websites, etc. So whatever that all boils down to, I don't know, but usually as shorthand, I'll go with journalist.
Did you come up working with the Young Turks? Is that correct?
I didn't come up with them, or that is to say, I didn't get my start at the Young Turks. The Young Turks did hire me in 2017, kind of on a whim.
Okay.
And so I did that for a little over a year and a half, I think. And that was really my major introduction into having audio-visual as your primary means of transmitting information. Now, I actually did at the Young Turks attempt to spearhead what was then the beginnings of an effort to incorporate more of a written journalism into that whole network. So you can still go find the archive of the Young Turks Medium page and other stuff where I did some of that. But I kind of, it synergized with the video component, which is obviously what they're known for. But no, that wasn't my beginning. I guess maybe I got more exposure to people who wouldn't have otherwise been aware of me through the Young Turks. But before that, I had been a columnist for Vice. I had written across the ideological spectrum for a variety of magazines and such, everywhere from The Nation to the American Conservative. So I was already somewhat immersed in online journalism for around 6-7 years before joining the Young Turks.
A lot of people listening to this show have gone from thinking maybe the establishment or the legacy media, the corporate media, is a little biased to maybe a lot of those institutions that make up all of that have an actual agenda. What are your thoughts on those things in regards to, we'll say, the corporate media?
It's funny because thinking back to when I first started in journalism, so this would have been 2010, 2011, a critique that I proffered, and you can go back and look at one of the first long form articles I ever wrote for a magazine was on this subject. The critique at the time was that the corporate media or the establishment media was far too tethered to an outdated, antiquated notion of objectivity. So they almost held up. So if you read like David Broder, for example, who's now been dead for years, but he was the paradigmatic example of a columnist at the Washington Post who, although he was a columnist and although he was like theoretically enabled to present his opinions, he would always have this posture of floating above it all, where he would just kind of issue edicts from on high. And it was all because he was endowed with this mystical power of objectivity, so that, one side versus the other side were never right about everything. And that kind of mentality was embraced whole hog by almost the entirety of the media, so that it was a taboo to be upfront with what your personal views were. It was taboo to say who you were voting for, or what your opinion was on the president, in at least a direct fashion. Even going back decades, you can kind of get insights into what people in the media thought about things on a personal level, but you were not supposed to be so upfront about it. And really that created what I thought at the time was justified suspicion. Because if you're always having to guess about what a journalist thought on a private level, or that they were withholding information from you about their personal views, then that creates something of a warranted mistrust between you and the journalist who is providing information to you. And there were always kind of alt magazines and ideologically driven magazines. Like I started at The Nation magazine, which was an avowedly left-wing magazine. So nobody had to really hide much of anything at that magazine. But if you went into the more establishment, mainstream corporate venues of media, by and large, this notion of objectivity was what was subscribed to. So I've always thought there ought to be some kind of corrective. There should be a correction to that mentality, which was then so pervasive. And then 2016 comes along. We do get a correction, which is fueled by this combination of Trump and social media. And now the correction is almost worse than what was corrected. So now you have journalists who don't even aspire to not be objective, or I would draw a distinction here, not to be objective, because that was never really possible in the first place. But they don't even aspire to be impartial. They don't aspire to be impartial arbiters of facts, or they don't aspire to give everybody a fair shake. With the specter of Trump that had so dominated the media's consciousness for that 5-year period, and maybe even now to some extent with this impeachment trial coming up, the calculation shifted. So it was that we have a fascist menace who is this interloper who has taken over the political system, and therefore impartiality is almost morally untenable. We know in what direction to be partial, which is that this needs to end, meaning Trump's reign, right? And so it really had caused me, and I think also some others who had a similar critique going back 10 years, to reevaluate what does it mean to be, because I have a following from across. When people get in touch with me and give me feedback, it's people of every ideological disposition. And one thing they'll tend to say to me, and which I genuinely appreciate, is, I don't always agree with you. Maybe I don't agree with you 75, 80% of the time, but I believe you to be fair. I believe that you're not lying to me. And I believe that you're not indebted to any one political faction necessarily. And I don't think you could say that for a vast lion's share of the media right now, including even the most conventional elements of the media like CNN prime time. I mean, CNN was formed in the 80s to be neutral, and that had problems unto itself. I mean, if you were just neutrally relaying the government's rationale for launching a preemptive war, that can have damaging second and third order effects as well. But now, after 5 years of just open campaigning against Trump and boosting of the Trump opponents, we've gotten to a bizarre situation where the status quo of journalism is not that there's an excess reliance on objectivity, it's that there's an excess reliance on I don't even want to say necessarily activism, but responding to the incentives of their own insulated class in such a manner, meaning in such a manner as to oppose Trump that it has dwarfed any semblance of impartiality in my mind. And so, it's an odd predicament now. But that overcorrection is not something I would have anticipated 10 years ago, but it came, and I think it's having long-lasting deleterious effects on the trust that people have in the media. I mean, if you distrust the media overall, and obviously the media is not a monolith, but if your just baseline instinct is to not trust the media, then I can't say I blame you anymore, given their conduct. I mean, I was very much involved in, for example, trying to chronicle the Russaigate issue, and to me, the media's conduct over the course of that was just beyond reprehensible in countless ways, and so on and so forth. Even back during stop me if I'm going on too long, but even when I went on this nationwide tour last summer to kind of evaluate the after effects of the riots, which turned out to be the most destructive riots in 50 plus years in the United States, I couldn't help but thinking that there was a concerted cover-up, just in the sense of the enormity of it, or the scale of it hadn't really been conveyed at all by the kind of mainstream organs of media consensus. So all that is to say that if you think that there's an agenda that's operative, you're probably right. You have to have a little bit of nuance in terms of how you interpret it or filter it. Like, I don't think it's very useful to just declare fake news and think that the issue is settled. I think that could be nihilistic, and I think it's also a convenient slogan to discount inconvenient information if, say, you're a politician like Donald Trump. But at the same time, I mean, if the media still refuses to reckon with the extent to which its credibility is cratered, then they're the delusional ones, not the people who rightly lack any kind of faith in what it is that they're putting out there.
I want to tell you guys about one of my favorite sponsors, and that is Lucky Guy Bakery over at luckyguybakery.com. You already know this because you've heard me talk about them before. They make the world's greatest brownies with flavors like, well, my personal favorite, the Oatmeal Jackson, which is made with white chocolate and cranberries. They've got the peanut butter bonanza bar. Of course, they've got the iconic brownie with dark chocolate slabs. And think about this. Speaking of that, Valentine's Day is coming up. What a perfect way to surprise and impress your lady or your man. Get them some of these wonderful brownies. You know they're going to pair well with a good wine. And what will that lead to? Well, you can thank me later. And one way that I'm going to help you out with this, I've got a promo code for you. That is BUCK, Buck. When you enter that promo code, after you're done shopping at luckyguybakery.com, you will get 20% off of your order. How cool is that? They've got gift boxes over there. You can order the 4-pack, the 6-pack. You can customize your gift box, and each one of them comes with a personalized note made by the people over at Lucky Guy Bakery. So I've got you all set up for Valentine's Day, guys. Thank me later. luckyguybakery.com. Promo code BUCK gets you 20% off of your order. Let's get back to the show.
Does it seem like the cratering faith that a lot of the public might have in media, mainstream outlets, CNN, New York Times, etc., has that helped boost people like you, Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi? Do you find that maybe in communications with some of your peers that things have gotten better for your readership and your widespread popularity?
Well, look, I mean, there definitely is an opening now, more so than there had been in the past, for independent journalism, independent analysis in a way that is not under the umbrella of corporate media entities, just by way of technological advances. I mean, we have platforms now on Patreon, Substack, crowdfunding, where you can, if you reach a wide enough audience, have a sustainable income, which, in the very recent past, I would say 5 years ago, was probably nowhere near as attainable as it is now. So that's a positive. And I think the fact that some of the people that you mentioned there have garnered such a wide audience, again, across the political spectrum, I think this would apply to those two as well, shows that there's kind of a non-partisan aversion or apprehension about these consensus views that are kind of manufactured and foisted upon us as a public. And it goes beyond kind of these petty, superficial Democrat versus Republican games that tend to be used to distract the public away from more fundamental issues. So yeah, I do think that this suffocating conformity, which has consumed so much of the media, has created an opening where those who provide a counterweight, or those who are actively attempting to resist succumbing to that conformism, they do have an opportunity, maybe more so than they might have in the past. And so that's a reason for some kind of tentative optimism. And it's in line with the kind of tenor of the feedback that I do generally get from, again, even everybody ranging from diehard leftists, communists to, hardcore right wingers. Right. There's a unanimity in terms of this well-founded skepticism of the predominant narratives being thrusted upon us. So that increased awareness is probably a beneficial side effect of all the stifling conformity, which has become so ubiquitous in most of the media. But at the same time, it's very hard for just independent journalists kind of acting in this atomized way So I mean, you could have a substantial amount of influence if you're very well known and you have a podcast and you have a Substack or a Patreon or and what have you. I mean, it's enough to be self-sustainable, but it's very difficult in that to compete overall.
Okay.
With the influence of like the New York Times or the Washington Post. I mean, one New York Times story can drive the entire country's political debate for the subsequent 72 hours. And so as much as there is reason for optimism, I think in some respects, still these mainstream organs haven't diminished very much, or in terms of the leverage that they wield over the public. I think maybe to some extent they have, but not enough where the independents or the anti-corporate media contingents can just declare victory.
One of the things I noticed a lot through the Trump years, and I think like everyone, my opinions, thoughts, the way I saw things changed multiple times. I mean, that it's really the last 4 or 5 years are like something I've never seen before, politically, media-wise, and all of this. One of the things I would think is I would find these journalists like yourself that I was pretty sure were not Trumpers by any means, and maybe leaned left. And if they were reporting honestly on Russiagate and these type of things, it like the amount of principled intellectual integrity that takes, well, it became pretty rare, to be quite honest. And so it was always impressive. And I wanted to ask you, over these last several years, what big takeaways do you have from what we can call the Trump years? Really, you can take this wherever you want, whether it be your work, the way certain people reacted to certain things he did. What big takeaways do you have?
Yeah, it's a big topic. I do think that the conduct of the media, which I touched on before, is a major consequence of the Trump years, and that genie can't be put back in the bottle, I don't think. Maybe we'll just return to some kind of stale normacy now with Biden in the White House, but and it is true that the level of intensity around Trump just as a personage probably was not going to be sustainable in the long term. I mean, the way in which he consumed the waking lives of people for that long was kind of scary. I mean, probably more so than any figure in human history, as possibly melodramatic as that sounds. I think it has to be true, in part because, I mean, his political ascendance was based on his mastery, really, of social media. And if everybody's on social media and everybody's tied to, kind of wedded to their phones and computers all day, especially under COVID when there's less to do, then if you have a mastery of that form, and you're really going to have a huge impact just on the day-to-day experiences of the public in a way that just wasn't possible fast. So a takeaway from me, and I don't know still what the final ramifications of this are, but just the way that he was so dominant in our collective consciousness is a ominous portent for what future political figures can possibly do if maybe Trump's ascendance can't be replicated in exactly the same way. In fact, I sort of doubt it can. But if you can reach that level of ubiquity, then that shows that there's something about our political / entertainment / civic culture which lends itself to that kind of potential mass manipulation. I do think, on the issue of Russiagate, which really, if you think about it, was possibly the dominant theme of the entire Trump presidency, and it began well before he even took office. The skewed way in which that was portrayed, I think, could truly have some harmful, long-lasting effects, and almost certainly will, and already has, really. But it in essence was this kind of soft coup, and I don't use the word coup in a literal sense. That's why I append the word soft before it, because it wasn't like an armed attempted takeover of the government. But it was an attempt by the national security state apparatus, which predated Trump and will now outlive Trump, to attempt to expel what it perceived to be a hostile intruder into its system. Right. The initial impetus for Russiagate, I think, it has now been established at this point, was that Trump had notions about U.S. foreign policy, which they found to be anathema, around NATO, around his kind of sense of a transactional diplomacy as opposed to a diplomacy that was predicated on America's singular force for good in the world. And they successfully hampered Trump. And when I say they, I'm talking about elements within the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, who work in concert with the corporate media often. They did successfully hamper Trump's first several years in office in a way that made it much more difficult for him to seize upon what had been a pretty historic opportunity. I mean, think about it. He defeated the reigning dynasty in the Republican Party. He then defeated the Bushes in the primaries. He then defeated the reigning dynasty in the Democratic Party, the Clintons, both of whom have kind of been appointed or anointed to be the stewards of elite American politics for decades. And then he could have truly, to use a kind of cliche, he could have shaken up the system in a fundamental way if he had the wherewithal to do so. And I think part of it was a result of his own lack of discipline, lack of ideological coherence, which ultimately rendered that impossible to achieve. But it was also these external forces emanating out of the security state apparatus, which kind of kneecapped him almost right away before he even took office, such that you had this engine of polarization looming over him of the Russia episode. So it was a rallying point for his opposition and also for his supporters, but it also hamstrung him so that even if he had wanted to, even if he had the discipline to do so, which is doubtful, but even if he could have summoned that wherewithal to kind of be almost a third party president or an independent candidate who had staged a successful hostile takeover of one party, even if he wanted to do that, because he was always at risk of potentially being impeached, which he was twice, or being removed from office, he had to maintain support among factions of the Republican Party, which had been initially hostile to him, then came around, but I think prevented him from being a more ideologically adventurous president that he could have been. So this is also to say that Russiagate, and this is sort of ominous, Russiagate was a successful attempt to neuter a president who was perceived, at least, to be an existential threat, and it succeeded in crippling his legislative agenda toward what could have, I think, gained broader massive support, and also probably drove him crazy, so that he was unable to work constructively with Democrats to do basic stuff like infrastructure, which is what he said he was going to prioritize, and that never happened. So I mean that shows you. I mean, the deep state became a little bit of a slogan on the right, just to kind of castigate Democrats who didn't like Trump, and it goes beyond that. I think that the deep state had a nonpartisan overreaction to Trump that ended up taking on sort of partisan dimensions within the broader populace, but ultimately it stemmed from their view of him as this unacceptable interloper, and then the mechanisms that they employed to cripple him, to impeach him, and then ultimately to defeat him and get him out of office. It worked. I mean, it worked. So you can't blame it all on that. And Trump has many shortcomings, of course, but just the fact that that plan, and it wasn't like necessarily a centrally organized plan that happened in one room hidden somewhere in the FBI headquarters or something. Although there was some of that, but just the fact that worked, is something that I don't think really has been reckoned with yet.
And it's interesting. You hinted on it there, and it's a theme that I noticed for a long time, and it's foreign policy. And every time these same kind of names, John Brennan, the Clintons, the Bushes, every time these names that we see associated now with the Russiagate stuff, but if anyone gets in their way, with what I would say seems like a foreign policy issue, that's when the attack happens. We saw it with Tulsi Gabbard. We've seen it with Ron Paul over the years, even Bernie Sanders to an extent. It is funny because I don't think of Donald Trump as particularly well-principled and a deep knowledge of foreign policy, but just the little that he would say on, we need to end these wars, this is a waste of money, this kind of thing. It seems to me that that's part of what the issue was. Why is it? It's with Tulsi, Bernie, all these people. Why is it always foreign policy that drives the attacks on what seems like sometimes really good people?
Well, the United States is the world's leading hegemonic power, and retaining that status as world hegemon is integral to how the national security state self-conceptualizes. So if they see potential threats out there, whether on the right or left, anywhere in between, to the maintenance of that status, they will lash out. And they will attempt to subvert that threat. And I don't know how much of a threat Trump ultimately was. I think that their overreaction to him initially was probably irrational. I mean, Trump was pretty malleable. I mean, you could just win him over with flattery and telling him what a tough guy he was. You could, and telling him that he could just plaster his name on stuff, and you could pretty much satisfy him. So the fact that they even irrationally lashed out against somebody as ultimately ideologically empty as Trump shows you how much of a problem somebody who did have an ideologically well-considered view, like a Ron Paul or a Tulsi or somebody else, what they would run up against, because they would actually probably have the the presence of mind to enact some of the policies that run so counter to the hegemonic self-conceit of the people who kind of run the permanent state. So that's why the CIA, the FBI, they can deal with adjustments around the margins to like tax policy or to social/cultural issues, which don't have a whole lot of bearing on whether they can continue to persist in their intelligence gathering or espionage activities. That's all somewhat trivia to them. But if you get to the heart of the nature of American hegemonic power, that is interchangeable with U.S. Foreign policy, which is why they're on extra alert when it comes to potential challenges to the consensus premises underlying U.S. foreign policy. And Trump, in his own haphazard, kind of lazy way, did that to some small extent, and even then, it created this massive meltdown. So just imagine if there was more of a ideologically coherent, concerted effort to really challenge some of those fundamental principles.
Where does the biggest anti-war sentiment lie today in 2021 in America, in your mind? I think we saw a lot of the anti-war left kind of go silent over the years. And then surprisingly, it seems like there was a bit of a resurgence of an anti-war right in the last few years, but were they just following whatever Trump said? Where does the anti-war sentiment lie in your mind?
Yeah, and I think that we should spend more time, not meaning you and me specifically, but we as a society or a political commentariat should spend more time attempting to decipher whether the change of heart that is ostensible on the right was just a reaction, primarily a reaction to Trump, or a genuine reaction to the facts on the ground. I mean, obviously it's going to be a combination of the two, but as somebody who came of age politically during the Iraq War under George W. Bush, and saw, from my admittedly limited perspective as an adolescent and a young adult at that time, saw how they were just in total lockstep, at least from what I could perceive from my limited vantage point, with that war on terror interventionist agenda. For then just to do like a 360 tailspin and become an anti-war pro-civil liberties party. I mean, I guess you expected to see some of that around the margins. Ron Paul became a prominent political figure in part by reacting to some of that more disaffected elements of the right, but not exclusively the right. I think that Trump kind of fused together nationalistic type fervor with also an underlying aversion to some of the excesses of the Bush years. So I think you're going to see some of that stays on for quite a while. But all it takes is one attack. All it takes is one unforeseen event to really throw into disarray some of the assumptions that we currently have about the nature of kind of American political coalitions. So I do think you have to have something a little bit more ideologically well developed in order to anchor that anti-war impulse, which has always been a constant throughout U.S. history, and it's always been cross-partisan throughout U.S. history. If Joe Biden were to just tomorrow launch an aggressive war in Iran, I do think there would be a left reaction to that, a pretty harsh reaction, in part because Joe Biden doesn't really have much of a cult of personality that could obscure the reality of what he does on the world stage or even domestically in any context, really. So, and that's in contrast with, I think, Trump and also Obama and probably even Bush. Joe Biden is kind of just a vehicle, or he's just a figurehead in a way that several of his predecessors were not. I don't mean that he doesn't have agency in what he chooses to do as president, but just that he's not attached to this kind of insane cult of the presidency furor that surrounded definitely Bush and Obama and Trump as well. So I do think that you would get a harsher reaction and also the left is. The activist left has congealed in a way over the past several years, given just the overarching fixation on politics that I think has characterized how much of the entire population has reacted to the Trump years. I mean, we have the highest voter turnout in 2020 since the year 1900. So that's a broad-based activation politically of the populace in a way that I also don't think has really been fully reckoned with. But one beneficiary of that has been the activist wings of the left, which have tried to assert themselves, gotten a few people elected to Congress. So I doubt you'd see them just acquiescing to some kind of foreign military campaign, and they probably get some allies on the right on that. So maybe there is some kind of enduring coalition that can be forged in opposition to interventionism and excessive wars. Biden, I think, was probably on the whole fairly less hawkish than Hillary Clinton, for example. So even just him winning probably has some impact on that, just in terms of the median of the Democratic Party. But at the same time, it remains to be seen, and you could have one crazy event happening somewhere in the Gulf of of wherever, and all bets are off.
Yep.
I got to tell you guys about a great sponsor of the Counterflow podcast, and that is Paloma Verde over at palomaverdestore.com. They sell wonderful CBD products. I'm not kidding. I used their CBD. It's like a cool menthol sports cream. I put it on my lower back the other day because I had some back pains. The stuff works unbelievably. Right then and there, I was so glad that these guys are sponsors of the show. I had to make this commercial, and a new one for these guys, just to rant and rave about that sports cream. It is unbelievable. They've got CBD gummies, CBD pet products, of course. Of course, they've got the CBD tinctures, some soft gels, some salve. I've also used the melatonin CBD soft gels, and they are quite good as well. Nothing's quite like that sports cream to me. Nothing. It's just unbelievable. I almost wanted my back to hurt again so I could use it some more. Carlos and Vanessa out of San Antonio, Texas, this is their store. It's a small business. They're willing to sponsor a show like this. They want to give you guys a discount. So when you use promo code BUCK, B-U-C-K, you'll get 25% off of your order if it's over $75. And if it's your first order, sign up for their email list. That's an extra 10% off, combined to a total of 35% off. These guys are wonderful people out of San Antonio, Texas. Support them. It supports this show as well. PalomaVerdeStore.com, promo code BUCK, B-U-C-K, at checkout. And I'm telling you, get that sports cream. You will not be sorry. Let's get back to the show.
There's this feeling that they're trying to portray at this point now, that everything we can exhale, you guys. Everything's going to be unified, peaceful. There's harmony once again amongst the entire country. What are your thoughts on that? That messaging and any predictions, or just kind of thoughts on what we might have in the next year or so politically in this country, as far as their messaging, how it might be taken. You know, there's still 75 million people that I think feel kind of maybe cheated from this. I think it's going to be interesting. I wanted your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it is worth acknowledging that when you no longer have a president who's like, can we curse on this thing?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Who is an active shit poster.
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably going to diminish. That's probably going to allow for a little bit more of an exhale after that no longer is the case. I mean, it's amazing how Trump really was just sort of a pundit in chief.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how he primarily conceptualized the job, and whatever kind of ideological meaning could be imbued to that, he tolerated. But really, I mean, his political rise was just about kind of sounding off on whatever the issues of the day were, and that involved, also, tweeting manically. It was the one thing I've joked that the one thing I can relate to Donald Trump about on a personal level is that we both have definitely an unhealthy relationship to Twitter. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I can only imagine what he's going through now in terms of the withdrawals after having been banned for now a few weeks. I think that without Trump as the locus for all this energy, some of that energy just got to disperse. So that's what's reflected in people saying, okay, now I can exhale. You don't have to be, we are not going to be thinking constantly about Joe Biden in the same way, hopefully. I mean, what's there to think about? And in a way, I think that's healthy. I mean, there's been way too much obsession with national politics over these past 5 years. And the pendulum was going to have to swing at some point. Now, on a policy level, does that mean that there's just going to be unity? Everybody's going to sing Kumbaya and agree to get on board with whatever the liberal fad is that's going to be enacted by functionaries within the Biden administration? No. But the diminution of that obsessive quality has to have some benefits, I would think. But at the same time, the technocrats and the bureaucrats who were waiting in the wings to take power, they like that if there is going to be less scrutiny upon them.
Yeah.
Where you don't have to worry about answering to a crazy tweet every day. You can work behind the scenes, or you can work below board to just get your agenda through without much interruption. So I think if you're exhaling, you need to reflect on how you allowed yourself to be so fixated on the personage of the president, because that speaks to some potentially disturbing elements of your own psyche.
Yes.
And if you don't care now what the policy ramifications are, again, that is something you should probably bring up with your therapist.
Yeah, that's well put. Thaddeus Russell and I did an episode a few weeks ago, and he said one of the silver linings to a Joe Biden administration is that he can stop dealing with people that have Trump derangement syndrome, because it's just been insane for 4 years with these people. You know, if you just say this Russiagate thing seems like a soft coup, you're a Russian asset, or you're a racist, or you love Trump, and all of this kind of stuff. And maybe we can exhale and say, we finally get these things lobbed against us that are not true. Maybe that goes away, because maybe Trump derangement syndrome goes away. And you probably lived through, I know you have, I've seen attacks on you on Twitter through the same type of thing.
Yeah, you know, I could never calculate the number of times I've been called some variation of either pro-Trump or anti-Trump or Trump apologist or secret Trump supporter, something to that effect, because Trump just became this all-consuming frame of reference for everything. And now with that less potent, maybe people have to be a little more creative in how they're describing their political antagonists, which, you know, again, maybe their brains are just so pathologically habituated to thinking about everything in terms of Trump that they'll never get out of that rhythm. But you got to think, I mean, if he's just spending every day golfing in Florida instead of, you know, issuing executive orders and such, then maybe you got to move on. But even now, like, even after he's been out of office for like 5 days, I still get some remnants of that, you know. But I think that's right. I mean, I think with him no longer being like the sun around which we're all orbiting, maybe there's going to be a little bit more of a space for a little bit healthier of a political dialogue. I think it's going to have less people participating in the dialogue, because again, there's nothing that intriguing about Biden on a personal level. But then again, you know, a decrease in the size of the dialogue, but a better kind of tenor to the dialogue is maybe a worthy trade-off.
Yeah, and before I get you out of here, I wanted to ask you this as well. It seems like, and this is almost, I almost feel naive again, but it's just hard to imagine this is what is going on so blatantly. Biden takes office, and I believe today or yesterday, Gavin Newsom lifts restrictions. The people in New York, mayor of New York City, governor of New York, start to call for lifting of restrictions. Is it that obvious and blatant that they really were just essentially ruining people's lives because they wanted Trump to look bad?
I mean, I genuinely hope not.
Yeah.
I genuinely would hope that people in positions of governmental authority aren't that petty and that selfish that would be their primary motivator in making decisions of that kind. And if that were true, then that would be a level of cynicism on the part of public officials that is mind-blowing. Now, I mean, I do think that we are in, if you trust the data, I don't know how many people watching this trust the data in terms of COVID, probably not many, but there has been a decline in the number of active cases and hospitalizations around the country. So you can make a ostensibly worthwhile case or reasonable case that should coincide with some lifting of these restrictions. But again, if you have just this ingrained doubt about the motives of people making such decisions, you're not crazy. I mean, in June saw it myself. I mean, everybody saw it when all of a sudden mass gatherings, which these same officials had spent months berating everybody to not participate in, all of a sudden became morally mandatory. And they themselves personally participated in them. So it shows you how it shows you how that the principle on which they claim they were operating was a lot more movable than maybe they had indicated. And so I wouldn't put it past some of the more hardcore Democratic partisans from potentially at least factoring that into their decision making. But I also kind of urge against that being a basis for becoming what I regard to be a little bit more of some of the COVID denialism I see out there, largely but not exclusively on the right, I find to be nihilistic. Not that you can't have reasonable, rational doubts about certain elements of government policy, but if you think that it was all just a conspiracy or a hoax to oust Trump, I mean, so does that mean that we have like a worldwide conspiracy? I mean, was Israel in on the conspiracy when they locked down for a second time in the fall? I mean, we didn't even have as nearly as stringent lockdowns as happened elsewhere, like in the UK. So is it open to interrogation or further investigation as to whether some kind of political motive factored into that kind of decision-making? Sure, but I also think it's worth, at least from my perspective, resisting the temptation to then lapse into this nihilistic denial. And I say that as somebody in New Jersey who knows people in the healthcare field and such who genuinely were overwhelmed in the spring. And then I kind of run up against people online telling me the entire thing is fake. And I think there's a happy medium there that can be accommodated. And so I don't know. I mean, Gavin Newsom, I was talking to my grandpa yesterday, who's 99, and he was saying that Gavin Newsom, he's a real movie actor. I mean, so he just doesn't trust anything he's saying. And I can't blame you based on the track record, based on how COVID precautions became just a political football, and clearly we're not grounded in any kind of neutral public health guidance, as proven by the protest last summer, because the officials in question agreed with the aims. Just decided that, okay, do what you want, mass gather, I guess. Virus be damned. So in that sense, I sympathize with the skepticism.
This has been awesome, man. Before we get you out, also plug away, please. Plug your social media, where my listeners can read your work, all of that stuff.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I put everything on Twitter, as you probably know. I'm Tracey, MTRACEY. I do have a YouTube, which is not like a huge focus of mine, but I do kind of semi-regular just commentary. Sometimes I'll have guests on. So you can subscribe to that if you want the channel. It's just MTracey. And lately I've been writing a lot for Unheard, UNHERD, which is a pretty good website out of the UK. I obviously cover more of the American political goings on. And so you can find my author page there, and also write for other places. So it's all out there if you have the desire to follow along like you do, and which again I appreciate.
Yeah, man. I will. I'll put some links in the show notes page for this episode to your stuff. And Michael Tracey, thanks, man. Thanks for being a part of this.
All right, no problem. I enjoyed it.
All right, I know you guys enjoyed the chat with Michael Tracey. Follow him. Like I said, I will link to all of his stuff. It's really easy just to follow him on Twitter. Find Michael Tracey on Twitter, and that's basically what I do. And like I said, I read his stuff off of Muckrack. So I'll link to that in the show notes page. Let's see, what else can I tell you guys before we're out of here? DeathToTyrantspodcast.com is still where you can find my website, which has switched over for the new graphics. My man Bobby Pearson he's designed the new website for Counterflow Podcast, and we got to figure out how to get the new address updated. We're in the process of doing just that. Also, let's see, we are going to have a Patreon exclusive episode out very shortly. And if you want to join that, go to patreon.com/Counterflow Podcast, and you get the exclusive content. It's me, my co-host, Bobby Pearson, and joining us is Johnny Profita from the Peddling Fiction Podcast. He's going to be with us on that. We talk a lot of current events, Biden, Trump. We have a good time discussing all of that kind of thing, where the liberty movement will find the most traction in the coming years. We're enjoying some alcohol while we do it. And man, that Johnny Profita down there in Mexico, what a life he's got going. Pretty jealous. No, it's he sounds like he's having fun down there, and we had a good chat. Again, that's patreon.com/Counterflow Podcast. You can check that stuff out. and at Buck Rebel on Twitter, BUCKREBEL. Most of you guys know that at this point. But we got some big announcements coming up too. We'll get to those in the next few episodes. Thank you guys and have an excellent week.
You get split in fucking half, till I call the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
This has been the Counterflow Podcast, a part of the Renegade Media Network.